So the third type of law enforcement agent we see on this kind of bell curve are the outliers, but they're the dirty cops. They're the Mark Furmans, if you know what I'm talking about with the OJ trial. They are intentionally committing maybe crimes themselves. They're intentionally violating their regulations, and they can do things like even plant evidence. You don't see this very often, but it is absolutely out there. In the last trial we did in Hawaii, I had a Marine who was falsely accused of a sexual assault. This started out by an alleged victim who woke up to someone touching her in her barracks room. I don't know if that actually occurred or didn't occur because this particular Marine had a lot of motives to fabricate. But let's just assume that that did occur. She made a very poor eyewitness identification because she was just waking up. It was a dark room. The perpetrator had a black sweatshirt on, and they were walking out of the room. And the only time she was able to see them is when this perpetrator opened the door and the light was shining on them. And if you think about a scenario where it's very dark out and you're looking into a light area, you can't see anything but a silhouette. And so she gave a description which was very, very vague. And, she said she thought it might be our client because our client was on that hallway as well. It turns out that our client was at that time in his barracks room asleep and had never been inside that room. But yet these two dirty cops came out, and these were MPs, and they came out and interviewed our client. They knocked on the door. They believed he was the person that went into the room. They didn't read him his rights. He was just waking up. It was 2 a.m. They asked him where he had been, and he said, I've been here all night sleeping. We were able to prove that one of these law enforcement agents went around to the other side of the room where there was a curtain where no one could see him, and he actually picked up clothes our client had been that were on the floor that matched the description of what he might have been wearing that night. Now, again, matching the description was a pair of tan khaki shorts and a black sweatshirt, so not even, it could be a lot of things. He picked these up and basically got them out of the room where no one could see them, although our client's roommates saw this. And he then disappeared from the scene for about 15 minutes, and he goes and re-enters the crime scene. The crime scene at the time wasn't cordoned off. There was no photos taken. Nothing was done to secure the crime scene. And then he leaves the crime scene. So basically, he had planted items of clothing and our client's cell phone in this other barracks room. Our client had never been in. Then he goes and tells his buddy to, just has a random thought, well, you ought to call, this Marine's cell phone to see if the cell phone is maybe it could be in the victim's room. Like, how the hell would he know that? And so he walks over, and magically enough, no one had seen it there before. He called the cell phone, and our client's cell phone is now found in the alleged victim's room, which is very damning on his face. So our client's cell phone was found in the alleged victim's room, meaning he'd probably been there. Oh, and by the way, his clothes, which were shorts and underwear, which were lying on the floor, which, again, no one saw all of a sudden until he placed them there, were perfectly matched lying on the floor along with 2 slippers. And so that was enough. They said, this Marine's clothes were in your room. His cell phone was there. It must have been him. He must have been the person that touched you. And that was really the end of the investigation. And he was charged shortly thereafter and waited 18 months to go to trial. And so on its face, it looks like, oh, this is really bad because you have this Marine with their clothes inside of the room. He must have committed this crime. And then comes DNA testing, right? So we do the DNA, and not to get overcomplicated with the DNA testing, we did the DNA testing because with the DNA testing, we had a fantastic X-ray. You have to understand how many cells would be in a room of an alleged victim. You have millions and millions and millions of cells. And if our client was actually wearing those clothes or had the phone in there and was walking through the room, you'd have transference. You would absolutely know that the alleged victim's, her DNA would be on our client's clothes because he was in the room. Well, when they did this testing, there was absolutely no DNA from the alleged victim on our client's clothes, which pretty much showed he had never been there. And there was also DNA foreign, that there was DNA they couldn't figure out whose DNA, because there was extra sets of DNA that shouldn't be there on these clothing. It means someone had, and it was a small quantity, which means someone had touched them, their DNA had sloughed off. So we were able to show that someone had touched these clothing who shouldn't have and probably placed them in the room. So we went and had exclusionary testing done, which means that they get DNA samples from all of the law enforcement agents and USACIL test them to exclude their DNA. Well, lo and behold, the one cop that we believed had planted this evidence refused to give his DNA for exclusionary testing. every other individual was excluded except for one. And he's the only one who didn't give the DNA, and he'd be the one who have planted the evidence. So there's more to it than that, but we're actually able to use use our own expert, and show that the evidence was placed there by someone else. This other individual, was likely the individual who wouldn't give a DNA reference sample, even though he was a law enforcement agent. And the entire time, none of their policies were followed. They didn't take any establishing shots. There was no crime scene photographs. They essentially walked in and said, "Oh, I found it. Here it is," and walked out with it. So, once we're able to show that through forensic evidence, and we just went after the cops on how they essentially violated procedure after procedure after procedure. We caught them in lie after lie after lie, and it was probably the nastiest cross I'd ever done. But we were able to prove that these law enforcement agents actually freaking planted evidence on our client, which is crazy, but it happens.